Hello, this is Jon Rasmussen. I wanted to share with you something very interesting to me today. And that is if any of you have ever heard of or watched the show Skinwalker Ranch, where they're doing a lot of studies about interesting phenomenon there that are related to UAPs and other interesting things that are happening there. I've been watching it since the beginning. It's very compelling. They have a lot of footage and a lot of evidence of strange occurrences that affect things like GPS systems, video of crafts going through the land and then coming back out again. And then they have this phenomenon there they call the bubble. It's a 2,000-foot radius area that creates strange effects. It does weird things at different times. It seems to be affected to or attached to some kind of consciousness directing it. They've got evidence that suggests there's a consciousness involved in this. And so I had a theory putting together the work of Bob Lazar, who I also follow, and just other physics and new kind of physics, if you will, because all of this is outside of our current understanding of physics. All UAP phenomena, all this extraterrestrial stuff, craft being able to move in ways that defy physics and things like the underwater craft. And this is what I find most compelling, because underwater craft, or craft that even can go through land, where our physics find this impossible because water is non-compressible. So you could travel through air at a certain speed and you might reach a limit. Through the vacuum of space, there doesn't really seem to be a limit per se, maybe even beyond the speed of light. But when you think of going through water, for example, the reason that you can't go that fast through water is because, like, if you think of moving your hand through water, you can get to a certain speed, or any object moving through water, the water molecules that it's facing going into have to separate, go around the object, and meet up on the other side. Okay. And if it's going too fast, there's this thing called cavitation. The molecules don't have time to come back together, so it creates a little vacuum area. And that vacuum area pulls. Vacuums suck, right? So the vacuum pulls what makes airplanes go up because of the shape of the airplane wing. But it pulls and creates a force in the opposite direction, and eventually that force is greater than the acceleration force going forward. So you run into this limit. In fact, this is how I do all my exercise. I'm going to show you a video of this someday. But I lift weights in water because the faster you move your hand through water, the heavier it feels. So I do all my weightlifting just by doing these movements very quickly in water, and I can adjust the pressure, and that's what creates my workout. But anyway, getting back to this. So if you think about a bubble, let's say you picture a bubble in the ocean, let's say a large bubble in the middle of the water. And there's a small object trying to move through the water really, really fast, and it can't. It reaches a certain limit to how fast it can go because of cavitation. It hits the air bubble. It can go as fast as it wants to in the air bubble, and then when it hits the water, it slows down again. So thinking of this, and thinking of the way that Bob Lazar describes the engine that he's theoretically reversed engineered in this area S4 of captured alien craft or whatever. And the engine, it's sort of like an anti-gravity, but he said it's not really like that because he can crawl under it when it was on and it didn't crush him. It wasn't like a force that pushed like gravity. What I think it is it uses the concept of space-time, which if you think of gravity as space-time spinning like a vortex in water that will pull anything down. If you open the drain in the bathtub and spinning and you put an object there, it's going to want to get pulled down into that drain. That's the way to think about gravity. It's a spinning of space and time is a variable, and I know this from my shamanic training as well. So it's very, very interesting, and it explains why time changes when you're away from the gravity of Earth. It slows down and all this kind of stuff. So if you think about the engines of this spacecraft producing a field that is, to me, like a alternate space-time than the one that we're in here. So our physics are limited by the space-time we are surrounded by. You can only move so fast with normal thrust and all this kind of engine activity. But if you can create, and this is Bob Lazar's theory, is that these spacecraft have a kind of emitter that creates what I think of as like a bubble of alternate space-time that acts essentially like a vacuum, because if you have alternate space-times, they can't see each other. So if there's an area that has an alternate space-time in this space-time, it's going to look like it doesn't exist. It's basically going to be a vacuum, essentially, a kind of what I would call a gravity vacuum, let's say, in the case of being here near Earth. So I think what happens is these spacecraft produce their own bubble, just like the bubble in the water. They produce this field around them that is an alternate space-time, so they could move infinitely, essentially in any direction with any kind of acceleration, because they are essentially in their own space-time. It's like thinking of it, they're kind of in their own dimension. But the craft itself is visible, if you will, in this space-time, but the field that it's creating is this invisible distortion. And so what I think happened at Skinwalker Ranch, and there's a lot of evidence to support this, is that inside the mesa, they're finding this strange object. They've drilled down, they found ceramics and materials that seem like they can't possibly be from Earth. And they're old. It's been in there a long, long time, thousands of years. I think what might have happened is one of these spacecraft was traveling in its space bubble, and it allows them not only to move through water as fast as they want, but if you think about it, it can also move through land itself. And it reminds me, and I'll have to share with you this guy John Chang. You could look it up. Google John Chang, Dynamo Jack. There was an old documentary called East of Krakatoa that first introduced him to the world, and I had a friend that actually studied with him. He had the ability to manipulate his chi energy and create electricity out of his hands, heat, some sort of vibrations. And there's one part in one of the documentaries where he could literally take a chopstick and he sticks it on a table and he does his energy, and it literally allows the chopstick to go through the table. And it looks like it just was like built that way. And what I think is happening is he's creating a kind of anomaly at the surface of the chopstick and the table that essentially like almost liquefies it, almost melts it. And it only has to be at the very edge of this in order for it to work its way through the table. The whole thing doesn't have to be molten. Just the very tip of it that little by little works its way down through and then leaves no noticeable marks. So what I think is happening with these bubbles, with these craft, it's really just the edge of the bubble that matters most. That leading edge has to be outside of ordinary space-time in order to create what seems like a kind of vacuum in this space-time so that it can move freely. So when you look at this bubble at Skinwalker Ranch, and it's I drew a little picture of it here, kind of a little sketch. So there's a mesa, then there's the ground level, and then what I think inside the mesa is one of these spacecraft that either was flying through and got stuck or somehow crashed. And I think it's one of its emitters or whatever this thing does that creates this bubble is still operating on some like weak, maybe like idle, basically. And it's creating this bizarre force field that they've measured is 2,000 feet high, and they've measured it in the ground. I'll show you an illustration of it. And because that bubble comes right up to a certain part of the mesa where they've done these measurements of something underneath there. So I think it's just a remnant of its propulsion system that creates these distortions in ordinary space-time. When they try to pull things through it, occasionally, like a drone hits that barrier and can't go through, or a balloon, rockets hit something and move. So I think it's creating a distortion, and it also ties into the fact that these spacecraft, the controls are consciously controlled. So there's this ESP ability, and none of this stuff, like this is all stuff that is no longer really controversial. I mean, we understand about consciousness and the telekinesis and ESP and the ability to sort of manipulate things with consciousness. So it's not that out of the realm of possibility, even to what we know. So apparently, whatever's controlling these craft are able to do it consciously. And this is why there are certain occasions, especially if you watch through all the Skinwalker episodes, that they seem, when they do something in particular, like shoot off a rocket or do some experiment, the effects of this sphere seem to react. They change. It can do things. And then they get UAPs and all kinds of signs that something is happening. And they've even gotten words from this consciousness, whatever's affecting this, but it creates signals. It does all kinds of things. So I think whatever was originally controlling this craft is still consciously somewhat active. I think it's weakened because it either was going through the rock and it failed at that moment and the thing got stuck in there and it just isn't really operating at full capacity, or it, like I said, it somehow crashed and it damaged it to some degree, but there's still remnants of the propulsion system that are active. There's still remnants of the consciousness that was running this thing that are active. And I think once they sort of do more digging or whatever in the mesa, they may actually find this craft. But I wanted to get it out there that I do believe that this mysterious bubble that they can't figure out what it is, I think is the propulsion, part of the propulsion system, if you will, of a extraterrestrial craft that is still somewhat active, if not damaged in some way. So I think that's pretty much all I wanted to cover on the subject. Let me see and make sure that I don't have more about it. But yeah, yep. So I think that's pretty much it. And I'd love to talk about it more. I'd love to explore it more. I'm really just fascinated by science. You know, I'm an engineer by training and was fascinated in astrophysics and all kinds of physics and new quantum physics and other theories. So, all right, I think that's it.